All right, let's dive right into this explainer. We're going to uncover the completely wild truth about that sweet treat probably sitting in your kitchen drawer right now. We all just think of chocolate as candy, right? A comfort food, maybe your go-to Valentine's Day gift. But its actual history? It's this massive 5,000-year saga spanning 3 continents. It literally fueled royal conspiracies and, yeah, was built on the back of some pretty brutal colonial empires. Just picture this for a second. You step into an Aztec market in 1519. Chocolate isn't some dessert you eat after dinner. It's literal money. You spent it to survive. When the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés first walked into the court of Emperor Montezuma II, he was absolutely floored. The Aztecs weren't just consuming chocolate, they were spending it. Sacks of these little seeds were being traded exactly like coins. It's honestly mind-blowing to think that Tenochtitlan's massive economy was built entirely around a rainforest seed. And the craziest part? The Aztecs didn't even invent this stuff. The story actually kicks off way down in the upper Amazon over 5,300 years ago with the Mayo Xinchipe people. They were out there fermenting the sweet pulp of the cacao pod into this alcoholic drink long, long before it ever made its way up to Mesoamerica. So before you could use it to buy your weekly groceries, Mesoamerican cultures, like the Olmec and the Maya, they considered cacao a literal gift from the gods. Like they actually believed the gods formed humans out of it. They consumed it as this bitter, frothy, chili-spiced beverage, poured from way up high just to get this thick foam on top. Emperor Montezuma himself reportedly knocked back dozens of cups a day from golden goblets. And get this, they used those goblets once and just threw them away. No, really think about that massive contrast for a second. On one hand, you're counting out everyday beans to buy a turkey, and on the other, there's this immense, almost sacred value placed on the exact same crop. You see, the Aztecs couldn't actually grow cacao in their high, dry capital, so what do? They demanded it as tribute from the conquered lowlands. Literally, just 100 cacao beans would buy you that turkey. It totally forces us to rethink this plant, right? It was the absolute backbone of an empire's wealth, not just an afternoon snack. In fact, if you were a commoner, you were strictly forbidden from even drinking it. Whether it was being used in sacred marriage ceremonies, left in royal tombs to literally nourish dead kings in the afterlife, or given to warriors mixed with ground maize as this high-energy marching ration, this drink was the absolute lifeblood of Mesoamerica. So how exactly does this bitter, spicy, sacred drink turn into a massive European obsession? Well, when the Spanish first hauled these beans back across the Atlantic around 1528, they actually absolutely hated the bitter Aztec recipe. It wasn't until colonial nuns in Mexican convents started messing around with it, stripping out the chili and tossing in sugar, cinnamon, and vanilla, that they finally created a warm, sweet drink the European palate could actually handle. And once that sweet recipe was cracked, boom, chocolate spread like wildfire through the royal courts and elite gentlemen's clubs of Europe. It became the ultimate exotic status symbol. Spain actually managed to guard it as a state secret for almost a century. But when a Spanish princess married the King of France in 1615, the secret was totally out. By the 1650s, these super exclusive London chocolate houses were so tangled up in gambling, gossip, and backroom political deal-making that King Charles II actually tried to ban them entirely. He was literally terrified of political conspiracies brewing over hot chocolate. But here is where the story takes a really dark turn, because feeding Europe's insatiable new chocolate habit required massive tropical plantations and, tragically, brutal enslaved labor. The thing is, cacao only grows in this very narrow, super humid band right near the equator. You literally cannot grow it in places like France or England. So European colonial powers just replicated their absolutely horrific sugar plantation models with cacao in places like Brazil, Venezuela, and eventually the West African islands of São Tomé and Príncipe. By the 1800s, Portuguese plantation owners were literally marching chained convoys of men and women from Angola to work on these island estates. We're talking about death rates as high as 20% a year. It's just devastating. Take a look at this timeline. It reveals the agonizing delay of the Cadbury company. They built this incredibly wholesome family brand while at the same time profiting for nearly a decade from what their own investigation confirmed was outright slavery. William Cadbury saw an ad treating laborers as property back in 1901. He sent investigators out and they confirmed the horrors in 1907. Yet it took until 1909 for Cadbury to finally stop buying from São Tomé, and that was really only after facing intense public pressure. Now, while this colonial machinery kept grinding forward in West Africa, eventually shifting production over to the Gold Coast, the product itself was going through a totally radical technological transformation back in Europe. Remember, up until this point, chocolate was strictly a beverage. Then, in barely 50 years, a series of rapid-fire innovations completely reinvented chocolate. It went from this greasy, bitter paste into the smooth, mass-produced candy we all recognize today. First, Van Houten figures out how to separate cocoa butter. Then Fry & Sons use that butter to mold the very first solid bar in 1847. After that, the Swiss step in. Daniel Peter and Henri Nestlé invent milk chocolate, and Rodolphe Lindt comes up with the conch machine to make it incredibly smooth. Over in America, Milton Hershey essentially won the mass market race. He turned chocolate into cheap, everyday comfort food, literally selling bars for just a nickel. It completely cemented chocolate as an American staple, especially during the Second World War. Get this, the US military actually commissioned Hershey to design a heat-resistant ration bar, but they intentionally made it taste, quote, only slightly better than a boiled potato. Why? Just so soldiers wouldn't eat their emergency rations as a casual snack. How wild is that? So bringing it to today, chocolate is one of the most universally consumed foods on Earth. But the economics behind your favorite candy bar, they are still deeply broken. We're looking at a global market projected to hit around $128 billion by 2025. Yet despite those massive profits at the top, the foundation of this whole industry really hasn't shaken its dark past. As we can see here, the vast majority of our modern cocoa comes from just two West African nations. Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana produce a staggering 60% of the world's supply. But the farmers there are incredibly vulnerable to volatile global prices and climate shocks. Like in 2025, prices spiked to historic highs because of disease and underinvestment. But sadly, the farmers themselves rarely see any of the real wealth generated by their own crops. 1.56 million. That is the staggering, heartbreaking number of children engaged in child labor on cocoa farms in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana today. They're performing dangerous work with sharp tools and toxic chemicals. According to a landmark study from the University of Chicago, this is the very real, hidden cost of keeping cocoa cheap enough to fuel the global candy industry. Despite decades of these voluntary pledges and massive multi-million-dollar PR campaigns from the big candy companies, the horrific reality of the supply chain has finally forced regulators to step in. The industry actually promised to fix this way back in 2001 with the Harkin-Engel Protocol, but they've missed deadline after deadline, while many farmers still earn less than $1 a day. Now the EU is finally stepping up, making it totally mandatory for companies to prove their supply chains are free from child labor and deforestation. From those ancient Amazonian rituals to Aztec currency, and from royal exclusivity all the way to modern exploitation, this seemingly innocent candy has literally always carried a heavy hidden cost. It's this product perfectly wrapped into our most tender rituals, Valentine's boxes, Halloween bags, but it's built on a system that for over 1 million children today is anything but tender. So the next time you unwrap a piece of chocolate from your kitchen drawer, I really want you to remember this 5,000-year journey. Ask yourself, what price was truly paid for it? Will you ever look at a chocolate bar the exact same way? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. If this completely changed your perspective, keep learning, keep asking the hard questions, and I'll catch you in the next one.